Welcome everyone to the UN Global Compact Network Australia and Allens's webinar on opportunities and integrity. My name is Kylie Porter. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network Australia. Welcome everybody. I'm going to do a very quick introduction and then hand over to Andrew Wilcock, who's the Managing Associate for Disputes and Investigations at Allens, who UNGCNA partners with on our bribery and corruption work stream. So firstly, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we meet upon today. For me, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, future, and present and emerging, And you'll see that the UN Global Compact team will shortly be posting in the Q&A in the chat function down below an opportunity for you to introduce yourself and acknowledge the country that you're from today. So on that, I will quickly go through some very quick housekeeping. The first is there's the chat function below. Please use that to introduce yourselves to other colleagues. And as I said, to explain which country within Australia you're joining from. We will also have the opportunity for Q&A for this webinar. Please put any of your questions into the Q&A function. Any questions that go into the chat function won't be looked at, so please ensure that you put them into the Q&A. And finally, if you are having any technical issues, you can email us. The email address is on the screen in front of you. Now, before I hand over to Andrew, I also just want to let everybody know that we have our dialogue or Australian dialogue on bribery and corruption coming up in a couple of weeks. That dialogue is our annual event. We do it in collaboration with Allens. It's taking place in Melbourne in person. Yep, a very different format to this one, but in person on the 8th of November at Allens's office. If you are interested in joining that, it's an all-day event. It runs from 9:30 in the morning and includes networking drinks at the end of the day. We've got a great lineup of speakers, great number of topics across a range of integrity, governance, and bribery and corruption issues, including a short workshop at the end of the day. If you would like to join, please do reach out to myself or one of the team who are on this call today. So Olivia Stewart or Nick O'Sullivan. You can reach out to them on the chat function, or alternatively, please just send us an email at that email address on your screen. So secretariat@unglobalcompact.org.au. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andrew. Andrew will introduce our speakers and will be the MC for this session. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. I hope that you enjoy the webinar. I'm certainly looking forward to it. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Kylie. I'm Andrew. I'm joining from Wurundjeri country today. Really grateful to be here and to all of you for joining us today. So thank you. To start things off, the last year or two have been quite busy in the anti-corruption space. Over the past year or two, we've observed some pretty significant developments in the global anti-corruption risk policy and enforcement environment. So from a risk perspective, global and regional events like the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and turbulence in the global economy have created new operational challenges. From a policy and stakeholder perspective, new international regulatory guidance and domestic initiatives, together with the onward march of ESG, continue to ratchet up compliance expectations for companies. And on the enforcement front, investigative and enforcement activity is visibly increasing in some parts of the world. And in this context, today's panel discussion aims to provide an overview of some of the most important recent anti-corruption developments and the opportunities these present for pro-integrity businesses. And to have this discussion, we're really fortunate to be joined by our three panelists. First, we have Leah Ambler, who's the current Director of Corruption Prevention and Engagement at the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity. Leah's been in this role since May 2021, and she manages teams to develop and deliver integrity advice and tools and guidance to address corruption risks across the Commonwealth government, along with broader media and communications. And prior to this, Leah was a legal specialist in the OECD's Anti-Corruption Division, and she's also served as chair of the IBA's Anti-Corruption Committee. Next, we have Timothy Cooner, who's an associate professor at the University of Auckland School of Law. His teaching and research focuses on corruption, money and politics, and comparative constitutional law. And he's the author of a couple of books, including Tyranny of Greed and Capitalism versus Democracy, and also the co-editor of a volume entitled Democracy by the People. Tim's previously taught at law schools in Europe and the US, and most recently he was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Barcelona. And last but not least, we've got Michael White, who joins us as Head of Compliance Legal at BHP. Michael and his colleagues provide legal advice and support to the company on a range of anti-corruption and other business integrity matters, and Michael oversees BHP's anti-corruption compliance framework. So now we'll move into the panel component of our section, where Leah, Tim and Michael will share their thoughts before I turn to questions from the audience. And as has been mentioned, please write your questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we'll address these towards the end of our session all at once. So let's start with the policy environment. As many of our audience will be aware, the OECD's Anti-Bribery Convention is a foundational international anti-corruption treaty, and it obligates states to adopt laws criminalising the bribery of foreign public officials in international business transactions. At the international level, I think the most significant anti-bribery and corruption policy development of the past year or so has been the OECD's publication of its new anti-bribery recommendations, which provides guidance to state parties on how to implement the convention. Leah, I'd be grateful if you could kick us off by commenting on the key features of the recommendation and the implications these might have for Australian businesses.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And I'd like to thank the UN Global Compact Network Australia and Allens for the opportunity to join this session. I'm joining from Gadigal country. It's certainly a very timely discussion to be having on anti-corruption and integrity developments. There's so much going on internationally and domestically. So look forward to a really fascinating discussion today. I just wanted to start off by noting that the views that I will be expressing are my own views. They don't necessarily represent the views of the Australian government, or the views of the Integrity Commissioner, or in the context of my previous role, the views of the OECD and its member states. So having said that, a couple of thoughts on the major developments in the new 2021 anti-bribery recommendation. First, and potentially of most interest to the participants today, I think would be the introduction of a standardised approach to non-trial resolutions. This is a breakthrough in this recommendation, and I know that there were hours of negotiations to develop this language, which sets out basic standards for non-trial resolution frameworks. In terms of how that will impact Australian business, I query whether the focus on non-trial resolutions by the working group in its evaluations of countries' implementation of the new recommendation, which have already started, how that might impact the status of draft legislation in Australia on deferred prosecution agreements. So I think there'll be a lot of interesting developments across different jurisdictions in this space. The second is clarification on double jeopardy and multi-jurisdictional enforcement, with the provision for increased mechanisms for countries and for law enforcement authorities to consult when there are multi-jurisdictional cases, and the possibility of parallel investigation teams. So this may alleviate some concerns about double or escalating penalties through multiple law enforcement authorities investigating the same sort of fact scenario in a bribery case, which is sometimes referred to as piling on. Another interesting development is clear standards for whistleblower protection legislation. This is one of the most fragmented areas of law across members of the working group on bribery. So I think that these new standards really will pave the way for, and I hope will pave the way for, more harmonisation of legislation governing whistleblower protection. There's also a reference to the use of beneficial ownership information in investigations of foreign bribery cases, and so query whether this will have an impact on beneficial ownership registers among the members of the working group. The recommendation is also going a step further on small facilitation payments. It goes so far as to encourage companies to prohibit and discourage their use, without going so far as to call on members of the working group to also legislate to prohibit their use. And then finally, there's a specific reference to fostering and engaging in anti-bribery collective action initiatives. And I think that the Bribery Prevention Network in Australia is an excellent example of this. And Australian business and the various partners involved in that network have a lot to showcase that will be of interest to other members who are looking at how they might implement that particular aspect of the recommendation. So a brief overview there, but just some food for thought.
A fairly comprehensive suite of recommendations that could have implications for the Australian reform agenda. Tim, is there anything that you'd like to call out or anything that's specifically of interest to you coming out of the recommendation?
Yeah, there's one thing I'd like to highlight that is it looks at first to be a bit buried. It's under Annex 2 in the 2021 recommendations. And it concerns the issue of good practice guidance on internal controls, ethics, compliance, and so on for companies. And in that annex, the OECD recommends ethics and compliance programs or measures in a number of areas that include gifts, hospitality, political contributions, charitable donations, and risks associated with the use of intermediaries that are interacting with foreign public officials. And I wanted to highlight this set of issues which have to do with political access and influence because I believe they tie into one of the overarching purposes of this session, which is to highlight global anti-corruption developments and risks. I think everyone is quite well aware that when money or other things of value are offered to public officials, political parties, campaign committees, and so on, there's a risk of actual bribery. And I'm sure that risk is quite well appreciated by everyone in our virtual room. But there's another type of risk that I wanted to highlight in today's legal and social climate. And that's the risk of participating in a systemic form of political corruption. It's a bit of a gray corruption or a less tangible form of corruption, but it's coming to the forefront of the legal and policy environment. And I wanted to give just a couple examples of the way in which it's coming to the forefront. Transparency International's famous Corruption Perceptions Index identified a new type of corruption, which of course goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. But in 2019, the director of TI said that governments must urgently address the corrupting role of big money in political party financing and the undue influence it exerts on political systems. And TI, Transparency International, went on to say that public policies and resources shouldn't be determined by economic power. Now, the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, even going back to its rules on combating corruption, which aren't new, I think these go back to at least 2011, contains Article 4 on political and charitable contributions and sponsorships, which is exactly the issues brought to light by the annex to the OECD report that we're discussing. And those rules would seem to be, I guess, doubly important today. So you've got TI's report, and TI's report and the Chamber of Commerce recommendations on scrutinizing donations and charitable and political in nature. It also seems to overlap with public opinion findings that I find quite remarkable. So the same year, Transparency International highlighted that risk of undue influence as a form of corruption, citizens in 27 OECD countries responded to these polls by the firm Ipsos. And 70% of respondents, which is a massive number, stated that their economies are rigged to favor the rich and the powerful, and that traditional political parties and politicians don't care about them. So there's a lot more I can say about this, but Ipsos also covered business opinion, surveying executives and management in EU countries. For example, 8 in 10 companies agreed that too close of links between business and politics lead to corruption. And there's a lot of additional data on that, including the risks associated with paid intermediaries and lobbyists. And this also in 2019, this came out in the UN Human Development Report as a key obstacle to the achievement of the development goals. And then I'd finally also just tie that annex in the OECD report to UNCAC, the UN Convention Against Corruption, which mentions transparency in campaign and party financing in Article 7.3, and in the criminalization section, Article 18, developing this crime of trading in influence, which could cover donations and paid intermediaries in certain contexts. So I just wanted to flag that, because it's buried in an annex, but I believe it's actually quite a salient issue in today's evolving legal and political climate.
Thanks very much, Tim. I think the point that really comes through from those two answers is that this document is really worth having a look at and interrogating, because it provides a bit of a roadmap and an indication of where things might be going and what kind of soft obligations might crystallize into harder obligations over the next couple of years. So just to shift gears slightly and move from the international to the domestic sphere, another question for Leah. Obviously, something that's front of mind for everybody in Australia at the moment is the establishment of National Anti-Corruption Commission. Leah, it'd be really great if you could just provide a bit of an overview of what the proposal is, where it stands at the moment, and what business should be thinking about, what potential implications of the establishment of a NAC are for the Australian business community.
Sure, Andrew. So for those who might not be aware, the government announced the creation of a National Anti-Corruption Commission. The Attorney General's Department is responsible for the establishment of the commission and for drafting the legislation. The current draft of the National Anti-Corruption Commission Bill, so what we call the NAC, is currently being considered by a joint parliamentary committee. So if you're interested, there is a committee page with the draft of the bill and a range of submissions that is available. And that committee is due to report by the 10th of November. And the aim, the government's stated aim, is to legislate by the end of 2022 to enable the NAC to become operational by mid-2023. So in terms of the NAC bill and how it could impact business, the NAC bill provides the Commission with broad jurisdiction to investigate serious or systemic corruption, including in relation to persons who are parties to a Commonwealth contract and responsible for the provision of goods and or services under the Commonwealth contract. And this is extended also to subcontractors. In addition, under the draft legislation, the NAC will also have jurisdiction to investigate the conduct of any person that adversely affects or could adversely affect the honest or impartial exercise of a public official's powers or performance of a public official's functions, including, for example, transactions between public officials and third parties, as well as attempts by third parties to corrupt public officials. So, basically, this is new territory for a national or an Australian integrity agency to investigate potentially private individuals and companies. So just to put that in context, in the last financial year, the government published 84,054 contracts on AusTender with a combined value of $69.8 billion. That's a lot of contracting out for goods and services. And over 90% of these contracts were entered into with small to medium-sized enterprises. So in my opinion, one of the major challenges will be raising awareness of and uplifting integrity and compliance frameworks among all companies, but particularly SMEs that are engaging with government. And hopefully it will be a strong focus of forward corruption prevention work as the NAC is established. And I also see a lot of potential to work in partnership with the Bribery Prevention Network and to really dovetail with the great work that's being done there, particularly in relation to Australian SMEs.
That's great. Thanks very much, Leah. And I imagine there may be a few questions for you about the NAC at the end of the session. So please feel free to send those through if you have anything in the audience. Just continuing this whistle-stop tour around the world, we're seeing important developments out of Europe, the US, and other parts of the world that I think are worth commenting on as well. Tim, is there anything in particular going on at international level outside of the kind of OECD developments that we've been talking about that you'd like to call out that people should be paying attention to and thinking about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could say a word about the United States strategy, or were you thinking of broader international policy developments?
Yeah, the US is the lead global enforcement jurisdiction, is always of significant interest for an Australian audience. So grateful if you could comment on US developments.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So the Biden administration announced a new US strategy on countering corruption in December of 2021. You used, Andrew, that I think the word aspirational and sort of evolving standards of law. And there's a lot of that in the document, which I recommend reading. But there's also a lot that seems even closer to reach than something that we'd say aspirational. I'd say this is genuinely taking shape. So this is an ambitious document, and it aligns the Biden administration and therefore the various executive branch agencies and departments, including the FBI and the Department of Justice, with what I'd call a much more progressive approach to anti-corruption law. And by that term, I mean to contrast this administration's approach with President Trump's rather laissez-faire or regressive orientation to corruption. And interestingly enough, several of Trump's major donors and cabinet members and advisors are bound up in the Paradise Papers data leak. And the Biden strategy actually builds on a series of leaks that relate to financial secrecy and the illicit flow of capital in a sort of global shadow economy. So in many ways, the Biden strategy does appear ideologically and politically, partly as a response to what came before the Biden administration. And I think that's also true with the strategy's emphasis on identifying dark money transactions, opaque transactions in the real estate industry, where a lot of money laundering occurs in the United States. Now, so the new US strategy announced at the end of 2021 is progressive in a number of ways. I think the first of which relates to the issues I was just hinting at, going back to the Panama Papers and the Mossack Fonseca identities of shareholders and directors who are involved in the shell companies and who are accomplishing a number of illicit purposes through dark money. The Paradise Papers about the global shadow economy, which also exposed some ties between Russia and Trump or people in Trump's cabinet, as well as some offshore interests of royalty and politicians around the world. The Pandora Papers, there's all these, very catchy names and scandals that I know everyone's heard about. So how is the Biden strategy progressive in terms of this? It's attempting to address financial secrecy, especially the use of intermediaries who facilitate basically laundering of money and stashing of assets and avoidance of taxation. And it's tricky because obviously a lot of that conduct, not the money laundering part, but a lot of that conduct in terms of offshore investment and shell companies is perfectly legal. So the administration has a pretty high bar in terms of doing this kind of work, which is at the intersection of what's legal and illegal. So anyhow, the strategy is going to insist on greater identification of beneficial ownership. And that's something that already came up in a recent piece of legislation, the Corporate Transparency Act, which became law in January of 2021. And this piece of legislation does strengthen the anti-money laundering regime. It does increase transparency, and one of its main focus points or tools for doing so is requiring business entities to disclose beneficial ownership for the first time. And it looks like in the neighborhood of 30 million entities or so will come under the requirements of new rules bound up with this piece of legislation. So shell companies and opaque vehicles definitely coming under fire now and by the Biden administration. It's also a progressive document in terms of identifying the relationship between corruption and the failure of climate change mitigation. That was kind of a niche issue in the anti-corruption literature, but it's another one that is becoming more and more significant as the symptoms of climate change are being felt around the world. And the public opinion data on that does suggest now that majorities around many countries polled, beyond 30 or so, are saying that the impacts of climate change are already being felt and are an increasing priority for them. So that was one that I didn't expect to see. It's also progressive in terms of understanding how kleptocratic and authoritarian governments weaponize corruption to undermine elections and increase polarization. So there's references to corruption as a national security risk and as a risk to democratic integrity. That also builds on Trump, of course, because there are some famous issues with the 2016 and 2020 elections in terms of meddling by foreign powers. But it's also aimed at addressing not just authoritarian governments and rulers who are trying to disrupt sovereign elections, but also those who are trying to hide and launder their own wealth in the United States. And there's analogous developments, of course, in other OECD countries. And then, I guess finally, I would say it's novel in reframing corruption, corruption not just as a law enforcement issue anymore, but as a democratic integrity issue, as a national security issue, and as a precursor to climate change progress kind of issue. So there's lots of specifics within the document, but I did just want to highlight those general contours that I think are novel and cross-cutting.
Thanks, Tim. That's really great. I think you've done a really good job of drawing out why this document both shows the direction that the reform agenda might be headed in, that, we're looking at increased transparency around beneficial ownership and an increased focus on professional enablers of corruption, but also on the themes and the connections to the broader issues that are drawn out by this document and the real life implications of corrupt conduct. So that's really useful. Leah, is there anything from any other parts of the world that you'd like to comment on or draw out?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think it's, the US is often sort of held up as the primary enforcer and therefore the reference for all things sort of anti-bribery compliance. But I think there's been some really interesting developments in other jurisdictions that are worth highlighting. And I'd like to particularly focus on what's happened in France, which has been sort of almost revolutionary, depending if you look at where they sort of started and where they've got to. And this is all sort of available in the Working Group on Bribery evaluation reports. But in particular, I think it's a balanced approach which focuses on enforcement, but also on prevention and collaboration between the public sector authorities and law enforcement authorities and the private sector to really sort of uplift compliance and integrity across public and private sectors. So there was a suite of reforms in 2017 introduced by former Finance Minister Michel Sapin under what's known as the Sapin II Act. And as part of these, France created a national financial prosecutor, but also a French anti-corruption agency. And that agency carries out some really interesting functions in terms of complementing the work of the financial prosecutor, which investigates and prosecutes entities suspected of bribery and corruption, but also now, following those reforms, can enter into non-trial resolutions with those entities. And the agency has under the law the authority to audit compliance programs of public and private sector organisations to make sure that the 8 controls that are set out in the law are met. And so to do this, it can either audit on its own initiative, or at the request of certain actors that are set out in the law, or at the request of accredited NGOs. So it has this audit function. It also can audit compliance measures that are put in place following a non-trial resolution that has been concluded by the National Financial Prosecutor. So it has this sort of compliance monitor function as well. And it works hand in hand with the National Financial Prosecutor to develop joint guidelines, which is also an area that we often we hear from across the spectrum. Public and private sector entities want guidance on what good looks like when it comes to compliance and integrity. So the AFA has issued a range of really practical, really targeted guidance, which is available in both French and English on their website. So it's I see it as a really constructive, collaborative approach with that goal of increasing integrity across both sectors, so sort of bridging that public-private divide as well. And in terms of the outcome, since they were created in 2017, they've conducted 114 ad hoc audits, 72 of which were private companies, 42 of which were public entities, and has made recommendations in relation to 53 of those audits. So I think it's a really interesting example of a model that's showing a lot of success and returns on that investment of resources in establishing that framework. So I just thought I'd put that out there as another interesting example to look at, and potentially a source of information for anyone who wants some more guidance on compliance.
Thanks, Leah. I think we can all be a bit myopic or biopic in focusing on the US and the UK when we're looking for overseas policy and regulatory examples. So great to hear what's going on the continent at the moment. Michael, BHP obviously has a global presence, is subject to a really complicated web of anti-corruption laws, and has to focus on what's coming down the pipeline. And I imagine a pretty big part of your job is doing that. It'd be great to hear what the implications of the sorts of policy developments that we've been talking about are for BHP and how BHP goes about thinking about them and preparing for them.
Sure, Andrew. Thanks very much. And it's great to be joining today from Turrbal and Yugara country in Brisbane. So thanks for having me along for this. Look, in terms of these developments that we've been talking about, I think it's fair to say that we would welcome them. I think BHP corporately would welcome this sort of strengthening and this raising of the bar that we're sort of seeing that Tim and Leah have been kind to sort of talk us through some highlights on. I think from a BHP perspective, greater consistency with regulation and with legislation helps align and strengthen standards across the board. It helps the fight against corruption, as we call it, and perhaps most importantly, levels the playing field for companies that want to act ethically, whether that's at home or abroad or both. So there's some great stuff in what we've been discussing, and I think it's definitely to be welcomed. I think in a way, Andrew, it gives us pause to redouble efforts on what we're already doing in that space, the way I like to view it. I mean, these are great developments and great initiatives, and definitely focus the mind. A couple of the things that we've been talking about, I'm pleased to say things that I think BHP's been focusing on already for a little while. And so, from some perspectives, I see what we're seeing in terms of developments as being consistent or complementary, to steps that BHP has already been taken. Leah and Tim have spoken about beneficial ownership transparency, for example. It's an area that we've been focusing on. Late last year, BHP co-hosted with EITI in London a forum on beneficial ownership transparency, and pleasingly, we were able to join with several other sort of large extractives in making a statement supporting ultimate beneficial ownership transparency. Committing to supporting it and promoting it in our businesses and with our partners and with our suppliers, to disclosing UBOs and also to using UBO data in due diligence, which most people on this call will appreciate the importance of. So the benefits of those transparency measures, I think, are something which these developments are really pointing us to, really highlighting for us in terms of making it harder for corrupt actors to sort of get a foothold, to get an illegal or an unfair advantage in business, again, whether it's at home or abroad. It also sends, an all-important signal, of course, transparency, that corrupt behaviour just won't be tolerated. I always like to say that, transparency acts as a bleach against wrongdoing. And I think that applies definitely in this space with ultimate beneficial ownership. And then another benefit, I suppose, that I would like to think will come from the focus on beneficial ownership transparency is that it will make it easier for companies that are smaller than the BHPs of the world and our peers of the world, who perhaps don't have the compliance program set up that we have, to do that DD using publicly available information and the like, and really just driving home that sort of compliance message all the way down, through your partners and through your supply chain as well. So as I say, I'm pleased to say that beneficial ownership transparency is something we've been a big supporter of for some time. We'll continue to do that. The other thing I was also going to mention was a point that Leah actually took. She stole it from me. The Bribery Prevention Network, which is something else that BHP has been a big supporter of. I think it's a founding member of. And again, I'd commend anyone to go and have a look at the resources that it provides, these curated tools and resources to help companies of all shapes and sizes, wherever they're doing business, manage bribery and corruption risk. And I see initiatives like the BPN and equivalent initiatives that hopefully we might start to see outside of Australia as well, playing a really important part. Those are just a few comments from me in that space.
Thanks very much, Michael. And the more plugs for the BPN, the better, I think. So feel free to work it into every answer. Just shifting gears slightly, we've been focusing on developments in the policy environment, but as I mentioned in the intro, it's been a big couple of years for the world generally, and we've had some macro level events that I think have significant consequences for the anti-corruption compliance environment, including the pandemic, the war in Ukraine. Michael, are there any kind of points that you'd like to make about how these macro level events are affecting the compliance environment and practices of a company like BHP?
Sure, and happy to try and address that. I think the pandemic's probably, it's not even the elephant in the room. I mean, it's the elephant that's everywhere, and it's big elephants and small elephants. That's definitely been an interesting one from an anti-corruption compliance perspective for me. And I'm not sure I'm speaking just for BHP. I'm probably speaking for maybe a number of businesses across the board. But an observation from my end is I think that it's raised the level of corruption risk on the whole. And I say that for a few reasons. I mean, with all the regulation that's come from government, to help manage COVID, has obviously been a lot more interaction with government, for example, in relation to permits and approvals to do certain things. And of course, in terms of public sector, bribery, as you increase your exposure to interactions with government, particularly when business needs something, I think with that, particularly when business needs something urgently or as a priority, with that can come, a heightened level of corruption risk. So that's where the bar has been raised, I suppose, in terms of risk level in that space. Another area which has actually been a little bit nearer and dear to my heart, I suppose, is travel restrictions. As I apply the anti-corruption compliance trade from an in-house perspective, and perhaps as my counterparts at other companies also do, it's being able to get around and see people, colleagues, suppliers, partners, is such an important part of the work in terms of developing an understanding and making sure that you're drawing on a common set of values in getting about your work. And obviously, restrictions relating to travel have really hampered that. It's made it harder to, in some respects, perhaps to get to know who you're dealing with. WebEx and Zoom and Skype have been great during the pandemic, but I think they've also shown their limitations in some respect as well. So travel restrictions haven't really helped from my perspective, but pleasingly, I think we're starting to see it come back, although travel capacity still seems to be something which could improve a little bit in my experience at the moment. And then I suppose thirdly, and just at a more macro level, we talk about the fraud triangle. Most people will be familiar with that, incentive and opportunity and rationalisation when it comes to fraud. I think the pandemic has heightened sort of each corner of that triangle in terms of just creating a general environment where corrupt or other misconduct can take place. There have been higher personal financial pressures on people, on businesses, different ways of working, which I've just been talking about, people not getting together in person as much. And then, of course, a whole bunch of government stimulus and spending being injected, into economies around the world. And I think when you add a lot of money coming in, you add changed ways of working, you know, you add personal financial pressures and commercial pressures, you really can give rise to an interesting cocktail of heightened corruption risk in that space. That's a few comments from me. I don't know if others have anything else to share.
Leah or Tim, would you like to jump in? Leah, I might shift gears then slightly. Obviously, the other major global event of the past 12 months or so has been the war in Ukraine. That's significantly complicated the compliance environment for companies, given the broad range of sanctions that have been imposed. But we've seen private sector behaviour that has gone well beyond the strict compliance requirements of the sanctions regime. So do you have any comments on what we've kind of learned about, you know, the business integrity environment from the corporate response to the crisis in Ukraine?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think, you know, if we can take any sort of positives or silver linings to the absolutely tragic situation in Ukraine, I think that it is, you know, this is the example of where, you know, almost overnight, major multinationals made the decision to cease business entirely in a jurisdiction based on what that meant for their reputation as corporate citizens. And so this uptake of sort of ESG, responsible business conduct considerations globally in response. And you know, I think some people may attribute it to the sanctions legislation that was put in place in a number of jurisdictions, but I think it was really this wave of sort of public backlash and, you know, taking into consideration the reputational cost and putting sort of a dollar value on that reputational cost, particularly for companies that rely on the public as consumers. You know, I think that that's sort of been otherwise unseen globally, and I hope that it's sort of a sign of things to come in terms of the considerations and the global considerations going beyond compliance, but to how the company is perceived in terms of its integrity and its values more broadly, and upholding those in terms of its business decisions. And I know that that's not an easy decision for companies to make, given sort of the value of some of the contracts that might have been in question. But I think that for me was something that really struck me, and it was a really strong message, and it was really united. I mean, there were companies that were called out because they stayed in Russia, and, you know, obviously have made decisions since then. So I think it's a really interesting time, and that has sort of forced some major developments in terms of uptake of business integrity and really walking the talk.
Thanks, Leah. It's been really interesting to see what the response has been, and yeah, quite encouraging, as you say. So we've talked about policy developments, we've talked about operational challenges, we've touched on, Michael particularly has touched on a few of the opportunities for business in this challenging and fast evolving environment. But Tim, Leah, I'm just wondering whether you've got any other comments on the opportunities for businesses arising from the sorts of developments that we've been talking about today.
I have one thought to share. If that's, or Leah, I'm happy for you to go first if you have something. So yeah, just looking through the public opinion results that I've been seeing from global polls, one of them is the 2022 Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a really significant one when it comes to the role of business in most of the countries where I think, you know, the audience members are doing business. And in the 2022 poll, I saw a finding that I thought was pretty remarkable. The question was, do you agree or disagree with this statement? Capitalism as it exists today does more harm than good in the world. And this wasn't a survey of socialist or communist countries per se. There might be one or two on the list. But in this 28 country survey, only 52% of respondents agreed that capitalism was a force for good in the world. But it's not as though government is really faring any better. In another place I look in these surveys is faith in democracy. And that same 2022 report references, quote, a collapse of trust in democracies. And it notes that in many countries, including the US, the UK, Spain, and Germany, there's significantly less than half of the population trust government institutions and members of the legislative or executive branches. So there really is where I think, businesses today are operating in this environment of highly reduced trust and a great degree of precarity, of kind of instability in the social, economic, and political climate. And that makes me think of something, Michael made reference to it already today. He referenced companies that want to act ethically. And I know there's a kind of a collective action problem there because, at times doing the right thing is not necessarily the most profitable thing in that specific instance, and I know facilitation payments are a big area where, it feels like a minor thing. And if you don't pay it, some other company that pays the payment is going to get ahead in getting a permit or whatever. But from a big picture perspective, I feel like this is one of those times where businesses have an opportunity to really capitalize on reputational and legitimacy sorts of factors in this environment of distrust. It feels like one of the best possible times to coordinate, to collaborate, and to think about mission statements that are really backed up by concrete actions like the one I was discussing before in the annex, compliance and monitoring of political donations and trusts and intermediaries. And it seems to me to go back to the very early ideas of why capitalism was a good idea to begin with. You go back and you read Adam Smith, or you read like Ayn Rand or Milton Friedman, or even the Chicago School economists, and you see this very profound and moral emphasis on competition, on the merits of the goods and services being offered, right? Competition on the merits of your ideas, your ingenuity, your creativity, your hard work, and not on the merits of your political access and influence, right? Not on the merits of how you can game the system or punish a rival through some kind of corrupt deal. And it just seems like a really vital time to kind of reaffirm those basic values. And something I wasn't expecting to see in these opinion polls that I'm talking about is that the general public is actually looking to business to do that. So some of the findings, for example, are that this is a 2022 data point, business is the most trusted institution, ahead of NGOs, well ahead of government, well ahead of the media in society. And about 77% of respondents trust their employers, making the relationship between employers and employees really important, and between consumers and producers and the entities along the chain of supply and so on. And so, I would argue that business has a real historic opportunity here, and maybe even a mandate, which I wasn't expecting to see from the general public, to give people something to trust and something to believe in. And, I think the time we're in right now strategically is really significant for that possibility.
I think the word mandate's a really interesting one and a great one to use, Tim. And those are really interesting figures that I wasn't aware of. Michael, do you have any response to those figures, or the concept of business having a mandate?
Sorry, Andrew, was that a question for me? I apologise. I think my connection's coming and going a little bit.
No problem. I was just saying that Tim's concept of a mandate is an interesting one, and I'd be interested in hearing your response to those figures and that concept.
Ooh.
Michael looks like he's having connection difficulties, so I might ask you, Leah, do you have any thoughts or responses on the kind of why are we doing this type question that Tim has been teasing out?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's not a new perspective, but just coming back to corruption as not being a victimless crime. And I think that to get traction across the board in the value in preventing corruption and investing in preventing corruption and promoting integrity, it's important to put a human face to it. So, you know, from the public official side of things in the investigations that ACLI has conducted, we've really seen that public officials, you know, who have findings of corruption or who are indeed prosecuted following an ACLI investigation face severe consequences, not limited to sort of the criminal outcomes, but also, you know, cases where their superannuation might be confiscated, they're unable to travel, take out insurance, there's long-lasting impacts on their relationships and their future employment, and they're not necessarily aware of these or conscious of what the consequences will be when they sort of go down that path. And then from the corporate side, I think, you know, seeing the impact that bribery can have, I don't think there's more dark picture than the recent $778 million penalty against Lafarge in the US, where Lafarge was pled guilty to making $6 million in payments to ISIS to maintain the operation of their cement plant in Syria. And as part of that, you know, paid kickbacks from the sales of that cement to those groups, terrorist groups in Syria. And that just brings home, you know, the importance of the work that's being done here, because think about the impact that those payments had and that business decision had. Never before has a company been charged in the US with providing material support and resources to foreign terrorist organizations. That wasn't a bribery. That wasn't sort of considered a bribery case. It was terrorist financing. And I think that's a huge example of the human impact of corruption, of illicit payments, in that case to terrorist organizations.
Thanks, Leah. I think that's a good time to turn to audience questions. We've had a couple come through. First picks up on the figures that you were setting out a couple of minutes ago, Tim, and the question is, corporations trusted more than NGOs is a surprising result. Can you elaborate or set out how this might be explained?
I haven't attempted to explain that one yet. So this is, the methodology is explained in the document. If you want to Google the 2022 Edelman Trust Barometer, it will explain the questions that were asked. I'm not sure why NGOs in particular would be suffering from a lack of public trust, but it's interesting to see businesses on top. And it reminded me of data that I've also seen in Australia that was collected by IBAC, independent broad-based anti-corruption body out of Victoria, that was looking at levels of public trust in government. So not NGOs particularly, but the really low levels of public trust certainly in government and certainly in the media, and this environment of polarization and scandal, you know, is really striking me at this point in time. I just keep coming back to it. But no, I don't know why NGOs are getting the short end of the trust stick here at present.
Another interesting question. I might give this one to Michael. Question is, what does the panel believe has a greater impact, financial penalties for corporations involved in bribery and corruption, or the prosecution of responsible officers? Probably good to note there that the Commonwealth Penalty Unit figure has gone up from 222 to 275 with the budget yesterday. So financial penalties have increased significantly this week. But Michael, I'll give that question to you, and there may be, you know, third factors like stakeholder, you know, expectations and broader commercial consequences that you might like to draw out as well.
Yeah, no problems, thanks. And what was I saying earlier about the limitations of technology? Anyway, I'm back, so sorry for that. It's a great question, that one, and I can't speak for the other panelists, but I'd actually find it difficult to split which of those is more effective in terms of, you know, corporate fines and individual accountability. And I know there's been greater focus on individual accountability, particularly in more recent times. And I do feel like that probably is slightly ahead. I think people need to see, and it's good for organisations and society to see, that there are consequences, for personal consequences for individual corrupt activity. You know, a lot of businesses are very large. A lot of businesses can weather a large fine. And so as important as that is, I do think that individual accountability is a very you know, important kind of element that people keep a close eye on, and will make observations based on. In terms of broader stakeholder expectations, if I can touch on that, I think as I was sort of being kicked out before because of my internet connection, we were talking, I think, a little bit about societal expectations of business and the role that the private sector in particular has to play, which is a fantastic point, and with which we completely agree. I think businesses, ethical businesses that are conscious of those societal expectations, that's as much of an incentive, perhaps the biggest incentive to do the right thing, bigger than fines, bigger than individual accountability. It's just sort of that understanding that we're uniquely placed in the private sector to have a positive impact. So I think those things for me combine to, and they should combine to incentivize, ethical behaviour and legal behaviour.
Thanks, Michael. I think, that's really interesting, and there's a confluence of factors that drives these considerations in this decision making. We've got 3 minutes left. We've got one more question in the chat, which is about how technology can be used to trace dark transactions. Who needs to be brought into the conversation, for instance, banks to leverage technologies like blockchain and AI to trace dark money. Would anybody like to field that one or have views on that point? Quite a complicated question, but it's obviously a set of technologies to watch and that the compliance community is looking at, and that hopefully positive applied uses for will be found.
I'd like to say, Andrew, if it helps. Certainly, blockchain and that notion of traceability and understanding the provenance of things is, I would see as being supportive of, if you like, the compliance mandate. And so particularly the use of technology, AI, when you get to systems and monitoring activity, I think there's a great role for technology to play in that space. That's just a quick comment there.
Thanks, Michael. So we're almost at the end of our time. I think we'll probably wrap up there. In closing, I'd like to really thank our 3 panelists for today. It's been a good conversation, and it's great to have a diverse range of perspectives and to hear about such a broad range of policy developments and broader trends in the anti-corruption world. So thank you. We've got a QR code on the screen. If you scan that, you'll be able to provide feedback on today's panel, and feedback is always very welcome by the GCNA, or the GCNA is always looking to strengthen its programming. And finally, if you're a GCNA member and you haven't signed up for the National Dialogue yet, it's just around the corner. You can do so from the GCNA's website, and it's going to be a great event. So thanks again to our panelists. Thanks to the GCNA for organising today's event, and hopefully see you at the Dialogue.